O God, our Father, it is in showing mercy and in forgiving that you most especially show your almighty power. Forgive our sins and continue to fill us with the gifts of your love. We ask this through Christ our Lord. An unexpected visitor dropped in to see Aileen Don Bosco toward the end of December 1887, when Don Viglietti, his secretary, announced to the saint that Dr. Despinet had asked to be admitted to his bedroom. Don Bosco's face lightened. Evidently referring to the day's miserable weather, Don Bosco said, "By all means, let him come in. He is a good man to have on a day like this." Dr. Despinet had come all the way from Nice, France, to greet his sick friend. Actually, to Don Bosco, Despinet was many things. A friend through many years, one of the first French cooperators, an irrepressible public relations man, and to his first biographer. The book Despinet wrote on our founder in 1882 had a surprising success in France and in Italy. But it nearly ruined Don Bosco's beatification and canonization process when some overzealous official at the Vatican held it against our founder that he not only allowed his biography to be written and published during his lifetime, but that he actually had been known to have himself promoted its distribution far and wide. Fortunately, good sense prevailed. As Cardinal Salotti, one of the promoters at the process, put it, Don Bosco believed in the Lord's word. Let men see your good works. If anything, the book advanced the cause of truth and outmaneuvered the machinations of people who were unable or unwilling to see the good Don Bosco was doing. But let's get back to Don Bosco's humble quarters on that cold, dreary December day, 1887. It did not take long, Despinet, to realize how fast Don Bosco was failing. He brought to him news and greetings from the Salesians in Nice and Marseilles. They are the best loved priests in those cities, he told Don Bosco. And noticing that the founder had been moved to tears at the mention of his Salesians, Despinet veered his conversation to pleasant remarks. Don Bosco, he said, would you believe I can tell a priest is a Salesian even if I never saw him before? In fact, I could pick him out in a crowd of non-Salesian priests. But how can you, Don Bosco replied. Salesians have no distinctive garb. And Despinet, if a priest is young, if he is skinny and smiling, and if he is in a hurry, he is a Salesian for sure. Well, now, Don Bosco said with a chuckle, I never thought of that before. I remember telling this story years ago while preaching at a Salesian retreat in England. Seated in the front pew was an elderly, rotund, placid Salesian priest. As I got through with the story I just told you, he shook his head vigorously protested Despinet's portrait of the Salesian, in which he evidently did not recognize himself. And I think a good many of us would not either. But leaving Despinet to his pleasantries, we might do well to ask what our true portrait is. What is our identity as religious and Salesians? Who are we? It is no great mystery. As Christians, we might do well to remember that first and foremost, we are children of God, in name and in fact, as the Apostle John says so beautifully. For we have been redeemed by the blood of the Lord Jesus. And as such, St. Paul adds, we are not strangers or aliens, but fellow citizens of the saints and members of the household of God. As religious, we are men who have consciously and responsibly replied yes when Jesus said to us, come, follow me. We are among those of whom he says, I will not call you servants, but friends. For such you are, my friends, my favorite disciples, my nearest collaborators. There is one more trait to our portrait. We are Salesians. On the pathway of our religious vocation, we found providentially Don Bosco. Many of us still remember the opening prayer we offered morning and evening under the old dispensation. I adore thee, O my God, and I love thee with my whole heart. I thank thee for having created me, called me into thy church, and so forth. Shortly before he died, that gem of a Salesian, whose name was Father Francis Binelli, our first novice master in the United States, told me, from the day of my profession, which I made in the hands of Don Bosco, I never once failed to add, mentally at least, to the words, I thank thee for having called me to thy church, these words, and to the religious and Salesian life. I will forever bless the Lord for placing Father Binelli on my path. He was on the path of a number of Salesians, diminishing at this point. But in a very special way, it was my fortune to live as close to him as one could be during his last year at Newton, where he was master of novices and I was his assistant. He was a very special person, special in the undefinable way in which so many Salesians who knew Don Bosco were special. The novitiate was then at New Rochelle, and he used to help out at the local church of the Blessed Sacrament on weekends. I remember that when the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Hayes, came to the church for confirmation, the pastor presented him to the cardinal. Here is a true son of Don Bosco, Your Eminence, he said. If all the Salesians are like Father Binelli, we want more of them in the archdiocese. And I remember Father Binelli mumbling and moving away as far as he could, povero me, povero me. Amiable and self-effacing, he had his own brand of humor. You will note, he told us at one of the first conferences, that I am a little absent-minded. And then he said, no, a lot absent-minded. I forget easily and lift things around. If you find a breviary or eyeglasses or a beretta anywheres, they are sure to be mine. Bring them to me wherever I am. One day I brought his breviary to him. Where was it, he asked me. I've been looking for it all day long. The cook gave it to me, Father, I told him. The cook? Yes, Father. You left it in the icebox. That's what we used to call the icebox, not refrigerator. You left it in the icebox on top of the ice. Ah, he said, striking his forehead in a familiar gesture. Now I know. That's where I keep my medicine. So I said, Father, here is your breviary, and now give me the medicine so I can put it back on the ice. He would often tell with relish the story of Don Rua's first visit after Don Bosco died to the novitiate in France, where he was master of novices. They had set up a room for the superior in the tiny library which Father Pinelli used as his office. Don Rua stayed at the place for some 2 or 3 days, and when the time for his departure came, the entire community went walking with him to the nearby station. While waiting for the train to arrive, Don Rua called Father Pinelli aside. I have some money for you, he said, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. I am sure you can use it. Oh, Don Rua, Father Pinelli said, I did not dare tell you, but the fact is that we are in financial straits. Smiling, Don Rua took out of the envelope a crisp 100-franc bill, a lot of money. Caro Don Pinelli, dear Father Pinelli, he said, if you are in difficulties financially, what was this 100-franc bill doing in the French dictionary on your desk? Here, take it, but please don't use it as a bookmark. The truth is, Father Pinelli would conclude with a chuckle, the truth is, I did not even remember placing the bill in the dictionary. In fact, I still wonder where that 100-franc bill came from. This man, humble, direct, uncomplicated, we have said it before, had an amazing spiritual depth. He aimed straight at the basics. He insisted, for instance, that number one task at the monthly and especially at the annual retreat was that we squarely place ourselves before the reality of our religious and Salesian vocation, and that we do so with a few hard questions, such as, how do I feel about my vocation now as compared to the time when I first became a Salesian? Can I honestly say that Jesus has been at the center of my life, that I have drawn closer to him through the years? Humility, poverty, obedience, and suffering were his very life. I freely and responsibly chose to make it mine. How do I live it? He came to serve. How do I serve my brothers? These questions are as timely now as they were 50 years ago, possibly even more, since today the very meaning and relevancy of the religious life are questioned. You don't have to be a pessimist to note and to assert that religious life is in a crisis. An unbelievable number of defections. Do you know, all over the world, 200,000 religious left their institutes during the past 15 years. and an unprecedented famine of vocations have shaken religious orders to their foundation, threatening the very existence of not a few. Just before I left Turin, Cardinal Balestrero was telling me that the Holy See is now looking to consolidate some of the vanishing religious orders with some of the existing ones, actually asking the members of these vanishing or dying orders to choose freely among the other religious orders. And we Salesians have been approached so that we might open our doors to such as may want to remain in the religious life, even though their congregation is dead, died, or almost completely dead. Meetings of superiors at every level point to a prevailing sense of frustration in their communities. A former provincial Jesuit, American, but residing in Rome, told me it is frustration with more than a touch of rebellion in the younger members. And it is frustration with a good deal of discouragement in the older ones. In both, there is a nagging feeling that with all its restructuring and renewal, religious life is no longer the answer to the needs and aspirations of the individual Christian and of Christian society itself. For a sober assessment of the situation in our own Salesian family, we need only read the circular letter Father Viganò wrote on December 8, 1979, and the anguished questions he asks. We were over 22,000 Salesians. We are now little more than 16,000. The latest statistics in the latest Italian bulletin. Why? Why so many defections? Why so few vocations? And why so many disturbed confreres, disturbed in their psyche and in their faith too? Early in December 1979, Pope John Paul II called a meeting of the Council of Superiors General, among them our revered Rector Major. Several sessions were held over a 3-day period. On the second day, the Pope, who up to that moment had taken down notes mostly in silence, astounded the assembled superiors with this question. Is it possible, he asked, that the religious life, as lived for centuries in the Church, may have seen its day and may no longer be relevant to our times? Can it be that ours is the time for such institutes as the Opus Dei, the Focolare, we might add the Volunteers of Don Bosco, or the other similar secular institutes? From the lips of the Holy Father, so careful in his words and pronouncements, this is quite a question. If it means anything, it means that Pope John Paul is keenly aware of the real crisis with which religious orders and congregations are struggling. The reports of the superiors general must have painted a rather gloomy picture if the Vicar of Christ was moved to ask that question or those questions. We will see later how he approached the subject, throwing new light on what the answer might be to the question that so astounded the assembled religious superiors. It is of the utmost importance that we have a clear idea on what makes us religious. Clear in the deck, once and for all, of all notions and concepts that may indeed be valid in describing the religious life, but which do not constitute the bedrock on which it rests. Basically, religious life is a love relationship between Jesus and me. Only seen in this light does it make any sense. Only if to the question Jesus asks me daily, Peter, Henry, John, Joseph, Dominic, do you love me more than these? Only if to this question I can answer, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Only then does my life as a religious make sense and become worth living. As a student at Valdoco, I came to know a number of men who had lived for several years with Don Bosco. Some of them like Giovanni Caliero, Don Francesca, Don Barberis, right from the founders' early days of the oratory. And there are some present here that did too, Father John Domagno, Father Bocatello. Among them was Don Augusto Amassi. I recall he used to take snuff. He used to take it by the pounds, it seemed. His silver snuff box was forever in his hands, and his two fingers always like this. It was strong stuff, and all we youngsters needed to do was to get close to him to start sneezing away. Occasionally we would ask him for a pinch of the explosive powder, and he would answer, no snuff for you or anyone else, he would say. Don Bosco told me I could use it as long as I did not start others using it too. Please, Don Amassi, just a wee bit of a pinch. Okay, if you really want it, you have to get it yourself, right from here. And he would point to his chest, always profusely covered with the snuff that invariably escaped from his overloaded nose. Don Amassi had been a priest of the Archdiocese of Turin. Of this I am not sure. He was a seminarian, that much I know. Impressed by Don Bosco's work in the city of Turin for neglected youth, he began to go to the oratory and assist with evening classes. Then he joined a society. At one of the last retreats, he preached to the Salesians. I was not present because this was way before my time, but I was told by Don Amedei, who was a very good historian, as you know. He wrote one of the volumes of the memoirs, who had been present at that retreat. One day, Canon Ballesio of the Turin Cathedral, now here is Don Amassi speaking. We had been together at the seminary with this Canon Ballesio, came looking for me at the oratory. He found me seated on the ground with a group of boys around me. I told him to wait until I was through with whatever story I was telling them, the boys. When I finally got to him, he looked at me in dismay. I was unshaven, my hair mussed up, my cassock a mess. He said to me, "Quam mutatus abillo, oh, how changed you are, Augusto. You once that had the promise of becoming the pride of the Archdiocese of Turin. Look at you now. How on earth can you stand those disgusting kids? I told you so many times you should never have joined with Don Bosco, joined up with Don Bosco. You too might be a canon now, as I am." And who wants to be a canon? I replied, Amos was speaking. I am now happier than I have ever been. I just hope you are as happy to be a canon as I am to be a Salesian. But I doubt it. I thank God every day I am with these not so disgusting kids. Do you thank God every day you are a canon? Clearly, Don Amossi did not have an identity crisis. He knew he was what he wanted to be. A man who had cast his lot completely with Christ, who liked what Don Bosco did and the way he did it, and who felt that life as a Salesian was well worth living, and with gusto. We will be back on this remarkable man. In recent years, if a priest or a religious had serious doubts about his vocation, it was said he had an identity crisis. This meant that he agonized over the why and wherefore of his choice in life, as if he had suddenly awoke in a dark tunnel. A vocation in trouble is always a complex, disturbing thing, and a sad one, because it involves a person who, after identifying with Christ for years, suddenly discovers it was all an empty dream. Yet religious identify with Jesus. He is the raison d'etre of their vocation. Vatican Council II states regarding religious, through them the Church makes present in the world Christ the Lord, whether praying on the mountain, or announcing the kingdom to the crowd, or healing the sick, or inviting sinners to repentance, or blessing the little children, always doing good to all, obedient to the will of the Father who sent him. Seen in this light, who will say that religious life does not make sense? It makes sense simply because Christ makes sense. It is relevant and needed simply because Christ is relevant and needed. If we are tempted to question our identity as religious, let us just remember that we identify with Jesus. Pope John Paul, in the course of his remarks at the end of the meeting of the Council of Superiors General to which we referred before, made his mind crystal clear on this point when he said, listen, the world needs desperately the witnessing of men and women who cast their lot with Christ so completely as to reflect him in everything he was and did. Religious are meant to do just that. The fact is, dear companions, that we tend to live as if we were not quite convinced of this. Is it possible we may never have quite understood what it is that makes us religious, or a Salesian, or Salesians? What does make a Salesian anyway? We will deal with this last question at length in our forthcoming conversations, but let me just touch on it briefly now. Speaking of our Salesian vocation, we are likely to think immediately in terms of a Salesian's specific mission: schools, youth centers, parishes, retreat apostolate, missions, and so forth. But do I have to be a religious in the Salesian Society to successfully run a school, or a youth center, or a parish, to be an efficient and capable teacher? Here I'm opening a parenthesis again. I remember I was in the second year of gymnasio, high school you might say, at the oratory, when we were told that since some of us had not taken the state high school entrance exam, we had no choice but take it at that point. The test was to be held at a nearby state school, and we were given a refreshing course to prepare for it. A public school teacher, a former Salesian pupil, a man in his early 40s, took over the class for some 3 or 4 weeks. Unbelievable. We youngsters were positively amazed at the man's ability and efficiency as a teacher. He put our Salesian teachers, most of them young clerics, to shame. I'm not afraid to say it. We even said it then. The man had us on the palm of his hand, and we wished he could have been our teacher forever. So again, you don't have to be a Salesian to be an able, intelligent, successful, beloved teacher. Not at all. A few years ago, at Corpus Christi in Portchester, I had a gem of a coadjutor, the first and unfortunately the last ever in that parish. He managed our youth center splendidly. He was too, I must say, a good religious. One night, after a busy evening at the center, he came knocking at my door. This will hurt you, Father, he told me. But I have made my decision. I am leaving the society. I was stunned. In subsequent talks, it was clear his decision had matured after both reflection and prayer. I like youth work, he told me, and I intend to continue doing it even after I leave. But I no longer feel I have to be a religious to do it. I can assure you, we correspond regularly. I saw him only 2 weeks ago in Portchester again. That splendid young man will always be a Salesian at heart. He is now married and is connected with a New York State program assisting drug addicts. Now, one need not take the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience to do the work we Salesians are doing. A committed Christian layman can bring a dedication and an efficiency to the field of Christian education that might put some of us Salesians to shame. Why then did we take the vows? Why did we become religious? There is but one answer, and we heard it from the lips of Pope John Paul II. To cast our lot totally and unreservedly with Christ, to reflect as perfectly as humanly possible what Christ was, what he did, the way in which he chose to do it, the way of humility, of detachment, of poverty, of obedience, and of suffering. In other words, to be literally other Christs. Well, the crisis in the religious life, the defections, what in Father Viganò's words disturbs so many Salesians in their psyche and in their faith, our own personal mediocrity, all these things point to a sober reality. To be other Christs is far from easy. It is not for all to take, as the Lord himself said. But it is certainly not impossible for the generous soul whom he calls, if that soul relies trustingly on his grace. With how many such souls our society has been blessed through the years, our province too. Men so completely centered on the Lord that they might have said with St. Paul, I live, not I, Christ lives in me. These were the men who thought that the way of the religious, the way of the Salesian, was quite simply the way of Jesus, the way of humility, self-denial, obedience, poverty, suffering. The truth is, my dear confreres, this, for a religious, is the only way. Here is where I would like to take you to Baldocco, to the Baldocco of 60 and more years ago, but the clock tells me I passed all decent measures of time. We chose to make this first day of the retreat a day to spend in sorrow. Yes, humiliation too. As we examine our life, let's not be afraid to face reality and ask ourselves a few hard questions. Am I convinced that as a religious it is Jesus I must reflect in my life? Jesus, in his dedication to his Father's will, in his humility and meekness, in his poverty and obedience and suffering. Am I convinced that I am what I love? If Christ is not in my heart, in my thoughts, if he is not the supreme reason of my very life, if he is not my one and only love, then clearly I have not learned the ABC of what it means to be a religious. If I am shallow and superficial, if I think of myself as number one, if I am worldly and given to a life of ease, is it not because the Jesus I chose to follow is simply not in my heart? How far am I from being what St. Paul would have us all be? My life, my very life is Christ. I live not I, Christ lives in me. Let each one of us today make his own St. Augustine's words, Lord, that I may know myself, to realize how low I stand, and that I may know you, and know how many reasons I have to love you. If it is really so, or if we are not relegating the Lord to a second or third place in our everyday performance. And we must be very practical about these questions. Do we view the practices of piety as somewhat marginal to our work? Perhaps even an intrusion, an unwelcome addition to our busy day. How often do my thoughts run to Jesus? Who was that beautiful Episcopalian minister who wrote a delightful book? I read it quickly once, and I even forget the name of the author. The title of the book is Run With Me, Jesus. Now here is an Episcopalian minister who gave his life, I think it was, to the gay community and the drug addicts community in New York, and who was so busy that he had no time to pray. So he would tell Jesus in the morning, run with me, Jesus, for the rest of the day. The decree of Vatican Council on the renewal of the religious life, Perfecta Caritatis, in its very first article, puts Christ in the center of the life of every religious and of every religious family. This, the decree specifies, is the supreme norm. Every religious institution must make its own. I leave it up to you. Shall I continue, or shall we add it to this afternoon? It would be worse this afternoon. It would be warm. On November 22nd, 1962, here I go again with my personal recollections, but be patient. It was my privilege to be present at a private audience granted by Pope John the 23rd. I did not raid the audience myself. I just was in the company of one who did. He and I grew together In fact, even at Valdocco, in Lou, our native village, and then at Valdocco. At the end, we parted the ways. He went to the diocesan seminary, and I became a humble Salesian. What else? As it happened, this friend of mine entered the Vatican diplomatic career and was promoted to papal nuncio to Japan and consecrated archbishop. The day following his consecration, he was received by Pope John the 23rd. Notice this was 1962. A few months before the Pope died. One could see that he was not well, but he was in great form. He congratulated the new archbishop, reminisced about his visits to our village, where he said I had eaten the best tasting grapes and drunk the headiest wine ever in the world. Well, he continued, now I am a prisoner here, but I have lots of company, the bishops present at the council. It was the first session of the council. They keep me busy. And then he began to talk about the council. Now notice, there were 4 or 5 or 6 of us, but he was in a talkative mood, the good man. And he said, you know, people have strange notions about the council, but the council is really many, many things. For instance, the council is a great big sieve. You know what a sieve is, I'm sure. As a little boy, I used to do my share of sifting on the farm. There were no machines then, and the corn flour had to be sifted by hand. For hours on end, holding a sieve almost as big as I was, he said this, he made a joke, much bigger than I was. Of course, he said, not now, because he was a big man when he was speaking. I kept at it until I ached all over. The fine flour went through the sieve. The husks will be discarded for the animals. The councils will do that too, among other things. The Pope concluded. Separate the fine flour from the husks. I am sure you know what I mean. And Bernard Herring quoted before, sees in the defections that have plagued the Church a purifying process. Pope John said, in other words, he is convinced that a great many defectors from the diocesan priesthood and the religious institutes were men and women, for the most part no longer tuned to the values of the gospel, whose life no longer centered on Christ, but on the values of the world. Outwardly, if I may say, there could be no more successful community than the religious sisters of the Sacred Heart at Manhattanville College near Portchester. Some 78 or 80 nuns literally bask in the prestige of that college, whose pupils numbered young women from the most famous families, the Kennedys and, as I think I mentioned, the Crown Princess of Japan went through her college there. Being fairly close to the community, since I was occasionally confessor and so forth, I could see what was going on. The community reflected, the sisters, the atmosphere of the college, an atmosphere that was certainly not one to encourage poverty, humility, and self-denial. After all, those young girls were to be prepared for a glittering world. And so all too often worldly values took precedence over more important ones. The nuns were mostly from very wealthy families themselves, many with a long list of degrees after their names. They lived in a world that was the world, and not the convent, traveling far and wide to all sorts of conventions and seminars. Surely this was their way of building the mystical body of Christ. Why not? Although not all the sisters agreed. When in 1960 the new $2 million chapel was erected and the great crucifix enthroned on the altar, one thoughtful nun said, how utterly incongruous that crucifix. What's it doing up there? if he is not in our heart. Now listen to this. By 1970, the community had disintegrated. The nuns turned to other activities, many of them keeping to the vows, while most of them left the order. And so Manhattanville College, the pride, the showplace of the religious sisters of the Sacred Heart in the United States, if not in the world, is no more. It is now a state college, the great chapel, mostly used as a concert hall. The same fate befell to nearly all the establishments in the United States. The nuns that have survived the storm are regrouping with a totally different lifestyle in the new program, in which glitter and a sophisticated approach are replaced by the total gospel.